One thing about us human beings is we're not always the brightest crayon in the bunch. Sometimes, in some ways, it takes us a while to figure some things out in our human nature, at least most of us anyway. And I find that with the disciples of Jesus, as we read through the Gospels, and that's what we're going to see today in Mark chapter 8. If you'll turn there with me or listen along, we're going to find in Mark chapter 8 almost what I find to be a pretty funny kind of instance when Jesus has to really challenge his disciples to get with the program, with their faith and understanding. So let's look in Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, where actually there's another situation with people where Jesus is about to perform a really amazing miracle. That in Mark chapter 8, verse 1, that in those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and began to talk to them. Now, does this sound familiar? Jesus and his disciples are there, got a great crowd that have gathered. They're hungry, and they need to eat. They don't have anything to eat. And we can read, or that should recall to our memory, just a couple chapters back, read where a similar situation happened, where multitudes of people, 5,000 people, had been with Jesus and his disciples, and they needed to eat, and Jesus performed a miracle. Well, now again, we have about 4,000 people here, as we're going to find out, that they're gathered together. They don't have anything to eat. So Jesus calls his disciples, though, and says, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. But his disciples answered him, well, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? And already I'm thinking, oh boy, did they already forget what Jesus had done with the 5,000 people and the little bit they had, and how he miraculously fed thousands of people out of really nothing? And so here Jesus says, hey, these people are weary, they're tired, they got to eat, they can't go home, we got to feed them. The disciples said, well, how are we going to do that? So Jesus asked them, verse 5, well, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. So they have 7 loaves of bread. And so Jesus commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and they set them before the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000 people. And he sent them then away after everybody ate and got their fill. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha. So, let's not miss what Jesus just did. They got 7 loaves of bread, a few fish, 4,000 people. There's no way you can feed that many people with a little bit of bread and a little bit of fish. But Jesus did. By the power of God, Jesus performed an awesome miracle, which would have been amazing to see. If you've ever, cooked for people, served people, you got to have a lot. You got to have things, available. You got to be able to serve up everybody. And we're not talking about everybody got a nibble, everybody got a little bit. No, everybody ate to their full, and then they even had leftovers. They have 7 leftover large baskets of pieces. That's amazing. It's awesome. It's God. And that is another amazing miracle. The second time Jesus has done this. And you would think by now that people would have this figured out. I mean, there's no way this food just appears out of nowhere. The disciples know that. They've got to know this. And so Jesus here performs another great miracle, another great sign, if you will. But that's interesting because then verses 11 and 12, what happens? The Pharisees came out and began to dispute with Jesus, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Which is funny. I mean, that's really sad. And it's frustrating. Why that's so sad and frustrating is because I'm pretty sure, I can't prove it, but you would think that with everywhere that Jesus has been, with all the testimonies of whatever, Jesus did a lot of miracles. Now, maybe not everybody saw all the miracles Jesus did. But again, how many times in other places, and I'm wondering if this is a similar one, where even though the Pharisees, many of them did see the signs and wonders of Jesus, yet they still didn't believe, and they kept seeking a sign. And it's like, what more do you want, people? Jesus was healing people, casting out demons, making food appear out of nowhere. But yet that wasn't good enough for a lot of people. But Jesus told them, you're hard-hearted. You're seeking a sign. No sign's going to be given. They need to listen and to see what's already being done and said. Well then, after that, notice in verse 13, this is where it gets a little funny. Because Jesus left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. Okay, they forgot to take more bread. They had 1 loaf of bread. Do we really think that's going to be an issue if you're traveling with Jesus? So Jesus then charged them, though, besides all that. Besides, they're traveling, okay, they forgot bread, whatever. Jesus charged his disciples, saying, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod," he says. So Jesus gives an instruction, a warning to his disciples to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. And where does the mind of the disciples go? Verse 16, they reasoned among themselves, saying, "It is because we have no bread." Really? What does their having no bread have anything to do with the Pharisees and Herod? Unless for some reason they think, well, we can't take bread from the Pharisees. That just doesn't even make sense. But this is where sometimes, our human brains can get jumbled up and we don't think straight. We don't really listen and pay attention. And here are the disciples. Again, Jesus is trying to warn them of a spiritual matter. The leaven of the Pharisees and Herod, their false ideas and teaching, their sin. But all they can think of is, we have no bread, so he's getting on to us. And Jesus, then being aware of it, says to them, "Why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember? Oh, let me think a minute of what just happened the other day. Oh, let me think about, what happened before." Jesus says, "When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "Also, when I broke the 7 For the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said 7. So he said to them, how is it that you do not understand? Jesus was a little frustrated with them. And for good reason. I mean, he just told them, don't you remember when I fed the 5,000? Don't you remember when I just fed the 4,000? And you really think that I'm talking to you about how we need bread? Jesus was challenging them to think higher, to think spiritually, to think beyond human limitations, to pay attention, to think about and remember what's going on. And Jesus tells them, I mean, how could I feed 5,000 people, 4,000 people, 9,000 total people out of very little stuff? And when I tell you a spiritual matter like beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod, and I use that illustration, how is it that you think I can't produce bread? You ain't got bread. I can produce bread. So Jesus was telling his disciples, you've totally missed the point. So think about it again. What am I really getting at? What am I warning you about the Pharisees and about Herod? And thankfully, we have it all laid out for us and explained in many different ways and places. And we know what Jesus was talking about was the bad influence, the evil influence of the Pharisees and Herod and their hypocrisy and their false teaching and their sinfulness, lest the disciples be carried away in that as well. And so Jesus was trying to bring them to a higher level of thinking. And that's really what he's doing with us. And as we read through God's word and we're seeing all the things that were done, and we're listening and reading and hearing all the teachings being taught and all the illustrations and all the different things, we've got to make sure that we're really, paying attention and understanding. And there are some challenging things from time to time that we got to dig a little deeper to understand. But ultimately, to have that faith, to think spiritually, to really pay attention to what is being said and to what is being done, lest like the disciples, we somehow miss the point. So let's make sure we don't miss the point. Let's make sure we grow in faith. We listen to the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of God's word. And certainly if there's something we don't understand, much like the disciples often did, ask questions. That's what they did. We need to ask questions. Sometimes you get things like this, where sometimes you got to be challenged. Sometimes you got to be shaken up a bit. And that's what Jesus did with his disciples. And so for us, I would also say, as Jesus did, really in a more general way, beware of bad leaven. Beware of bad influences, of sinful influences, of false teaching. And let's make sure we stick to Jesus and his truth and his righteousness and our faith in him. And follow God's word alone. God bless.